All right, well, good evening, everyone. I'm so happy you could join us tonight in this beautiful, beautiful space. It's not our usual space, but I kind of like it. You know, we have this dynamic background. I think we should always have our salons up in the glass house. We have some new friends here tonight, and I'd like to extend a special welcome to them, especially our friends from the Aga Khan Museum, the Whole Note Magazine, and Classical Voice America. Now, as all of you know, Salon West is a city building project. This is the only critical forum on arts and public policy in the city. Such being the case, I would be remiss if I didn't address the loss of one of the most controversial figures in the city. Most of you know that I'm a former political staffer, having worked and run campaigns at all levels of government over the past 10 years. And you get to know a lot about politicians, government, and constituents during that time. So before Rob Ford was elected mayor, I was working on George Smitherman's mayoral campaign, and I spent most of his tenure living abroad. So all I ever heard of our mayor, well, it inspired a flaming, passionate hatred in my heart. And that lasted until I actually got to know him and had to work with him. I've worked with a lot of politicians and candidates, and typically my good opinion and faith in them would be lost over time. And to my great shock, it was the opposite with our former mayor. Don't worry, I'm not going to lionize him and forgive him all his faults, which were many. But I think as a city and as an arts community, there's a lot of food for thought there for us. City councilors aren't actually there to develop brilliant new policies. Their job is actually to make sure that everything within their ward works. And Ford was one of the few city councilors who successfully did that job for everybody and not just a privileged few. There are vast swaths of the city whose voices are not heard within their own wards, and certainly not downtown at City Hall. So there's a reason that Rob Ford was so well loved by certain ethnic communities and certain poor communities throughout the city. He was the first to try and fix the TCHC after those buildings were left to crumble and fall apart over the course of decades. To bring this back to the arts sector, while Mayor Ford was cutting expenses in other parts of the budget, the arts budget remained untouched. There were even new initiatives for the arts under his term that we still enjoy today. The Music City Plan, the Austin-Toronto Music City Alliance, the Music Advisory Council. All of these were actually created during Mayor Ford's time in office. It kind of blows the mind. He even created the position of a mayor's arts advisor, something that didn't come from David Miller, didn't come from any of the more polished mayors that you would expect that kind of initiative from. So, you know, there's a lot to think about. And even before he took office, he consulted with leaders from the arts sector before he spent a day in the mayor's chair. So it's really quite interesting. So my point is that as an arts worker, I need a mayor who supports the arts and will take advice from the arts community rather than one who simply attends the arts. I don't need the mayor at the ballet, but I need him or her to support the ballet. Most politicians are flawless, bad people, and over time, with great struggle, I came to understand that Rob Ford was a deeply flawed but good person. So I think that pretty much covers all of the Rob Ford we need to talk about tonight. So we should get to the music. We'll start off the evening with the lovely sound of Julia Wedman, a violinist with Tafelmusik, baroque orchestra and chamber choir. I'm only going to say the full name of your arts organization once because it's a little bit of a mouthful. Then we'll sit down for a chat with William Norris. Will is new to the Toronto arts scene and comes to us from the UK, where he served as communications and creative programming director. Ooh, that sounds serious.
It's another very long title.
It's a good title for the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, which is less of a good title. He's dedicated, it's true. He's dedicated to pushing the boundaries of a traditionally conservative art form, and we're dedicated to pushing our arts leadership to do more for our city. You see, artists don't exist in a bubble. They aren't locked away in bohemian hovels, smoking cigarettes and creating wonderful pieces of art and stirring music. Artists, and indeed arts organizations, are integral and integrated, or at least they should be, members of the community. Not just the communities where they live, but the communities where they operate. They create the visual and physical and sound space where we all collectively think about who we are and where we're going. So, whether we're conscious of it or not, the visual art and the music of our city shapes our lives. And that's incredibly powerful, no pressure. So arts organizations like Tafelmusik are a big part of this, which is what we'll be discussing tonight. And hopefully we'll even answer the question of whether or not classical is a problem. So with that, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming, and welcome to Salon West.
This is the first movement of the first fantasy for solo violin. Mad Men, because they're so detailed down to what the characters are wearing, the manner of speech, like even the little cigarette cases and the glasses that they use. So a period instrument is one that tries to, is an original or is a copy of something that tries to recreate something that the composers who were writing for this music would recognize. So my violin, for example, is from 1694, and it was made in Amsterdam by a wonderful violin maker, Henrik Jacobs. But the bow was made just a few years ago by one of my friends, who's a wonderful bow maker in Kitchener. And the bows are more likely to be copies because they're so much more fragile than the violins themselves. So there are a couple of main differences when you look at a baroque violin or hear a baroque violin from the normal modern violins that you may be more familiar with. So one of the differences are the strings. I'm not sure if you can see, but especially the upper two strings are kind of yellow, and it's because they're made out of sheep gut. So it's the small intestine of a sheep that's been cleaned and dried and stretched and wound together to make strings. And these are the historical strings. So it has a slightly different sound than a modern metal string. I think of the sound as a little bit more gritty than a modern string, not as clean edges. There's also a little bit more what we call chiff in the sound. So the beginning of the sound, you hear this very articulate beginning of the note. There's some structural differences that you don't really see when you look at it, but the bridge is slightly different. The placement of the sound post, which is the little post inside, is slightly different. The bass bar, which is the bar inside the violin, would be different. The fingerboard is shorter. And many of these structural differences are to enhance the resonance of the sound. So the modern instruments are designed to project in a big hall. The older instruments are designed to resonate. You'll also notice, does anyone here play violin? So I'm sure when you were small playing violin, you had what we call a chin rest. Here, on your chin. And those were only invented in about 1820. So we play without the chin rest or the shoulder rest, so it gives us more freedom of movement, but it also means that I'll play more in the lower position, so shifting up and down the instrument is a lot more difficult. So in the last piece I'll play today, there'll be something that I can't go up high. That's hard on this instrument. Now the bows are quite different, and I bought one of my later bows to show you. So the early bows are a slightly different shape. So they're convex like a bow and arrow bow. But the more modern bows have the curve inwards. And so what this does is that this baroque bow is very light at the tip. And it's very suited to dance music, dance movements, whereas these later bows are more suited to long singing lines. So I'm just going to play a couple little snippets of some of our most favorite dances. So here's a little bit of a gavotte from the Bach E major violin sonata. So they get that nice, airy, articulate sound. This is a little bit of a chic. And then I'll play a little bit of this courant, and I'm going to play a little bit on this bow and a little bit on my modern bow, just to see if you can hear the difference. So here's is designed to dance. So that's one of the fun things about using the right equipment for the right period is that all of a sudden, the things that you're supposed to be good at, you are automatically good at without having to try very hard. So that's one of the things I like the most. So we play in a historically informed style. And what does that mean? So that means that we think it's fun and interesting, inspiring, and incredibly helpful to go back and look at some of the writings of the musicians who were playing the music at the time of the music that we love. So it helps us to know what to do and how to make the music come alive, which I think is probably our #1 priority at Tafelmusik. And this was the era of the composer-performer. So at this time, composers were writing the bare bones of what we actually hear in the music. And it was up to the performer to add so many of the details, like the dynamics, how loud and how soft you were going to play, the articulation, how short, how long to play, much of the phrasing, slurs, how many notes to string together. It was up to you to figure out what is the mood of the piece. We call it the affect. It was up to us to add ornamentation if we thought it needed extra spice in it. We add more notes. And one thing that I love about some of these musicians at the time is how passionate they are about the music. So Matheson, who was quite well known for a duel that he once had with Handel, he said in 1739 in his treatise, "The Italian jig, in it you should strive for the utmost speed or haste, yet mostly in a fleeting and not impetuous manner, somewhat like a brook rushing straight ahead." So if I think about that and go back and play the jig that I played for you earlier, I think, okay, not too impetuous, like a brook. It's a very different attitude. And what I like is how detailed they are with the descriptions of how they think the music should be, because you can find 5 different writers who has a very detailed idea of what a jig should sound like. And I think the point is the detail in which they think about music. Another writer I love is C.P.E. Bach, J.S. Bach's son. And he writes about being a performer. And he says, "A musician cannot move others unless he too is moved. He must of necessity feel all the affects, all the emotions that he hopes to arouse in his audience. For the revealing of his own humor will stimulate a like humor in the listener. Thus will the expression of the piece be more clearly perceived by the audience. Constantly varying the passions, he will rarely quiet one before he rouses another." Which I think is just a beautiful way for us students of music to think about it. It's almost like an actor to think about becoming a character. So I'm going to play a couple movements of one of C.P.E.'s father, Bach's violin sonatas. And these sonatas were written at a very special time in Johann Sebastian Bach's life. He had just gotten his first big job as a composer. He was in his early 30s, working in Köthen, which is a beautiful little hunting palace sort of near Leipzig. You should go visit. If you're anywhere near the area, you can still go and see his music room and the chapel where he played. But it's not a big palace like Versailles. It's like kind of like a hunting lodge. So it's this beautiful, idyllic place with a stream nearby, lots of trees, comfortable. And there are all these wonderful musicians there. The prince he worked for loved music. This is like the dream job for him. He was there with his wife and their kids. And he went on a trip for about 3 months with the prince on his vacation. And he came back to find that his wife had died while he was gone. And so I always imagine that this beautiful, idyllic space is suddenly completely claustrophobic. And he wrote this set of violin sonatas on paper that was bought while he was on this vacation. And if you see the title page of these sonatas, it says "sei solo," which means 6 solos. But there's a double meaning because the word "sei," S-E-I, in Italian, means you are solo. 6 solos or you are alone. And the structure of the pieces is that we have 4 sonatas in minor keys that have a lot of very difficult, painful, lonely, sad, angry affects. But there is also with some hope and some happiness in them, but fleeting in the first. And then the 5th sonata is in C major, and it's really the turning point of this whole piece. So I'm going to play you the 3rd and 4th movement from the C major, which is for me the turning point when the sadness starts to melt away and the peace and the joy starts to come back to his life.
Your turn.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is William. I'm the Managing Director at Tafelmusik, baroque Orchestra and Chamber Choir. I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes or so on a few points, and then I think myself and Aziza are going to have a discussion and have some questions as well, right?
That's the plan.
Great. So some of you may have noted the title of tonight's event, which was What's Wrong with Classical? Reinventing the C Word. This title came out of a discussion I had with our marketing team when I was trying to boil down what I was going to talk about this evening. And it also comes out of some long-running thoughts I've had, thoughts which appropriately came up for discussion when I was being interviewed for this role with Tafelmusik. Essentially, this boils down to frustration with the word classical. I'll give you a few instances of this. For many years, either with the London Philharmonic Orchestra or the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, I would sit at our stalls at what we call Freshers' Fairs over in the UK. I think the equivalent here is Orientation Week at universities. Essentially, it's a huge fair where new students at university can sign up to sports or cultural clubs or have products sold to them by phone companies, supermarkets or banks. And there was usually a smattering of cultural organisations as well. And what I learned fast at these events was that your pitch was utterly essential. If you're set out to sell classical music, perhaps by asking passers-by if that was what they were into, you get a pathetically low rate of return. If, however, you were a bit vaguer and asked people if they were interested in music, or cheap tickets to gigs, then you'd end up getting some interesting conversations going. Of course, when people found out that it was an orchestra, well, some of them would walk away. But many more were intrigued and said they'd give it a go or signed up to a mailing list. Sitting there all day talking to people, while exhausting, was therefore an interesting market research exercise. It was clear that the words classical or orchestra would for many people conjure up an instant image of something they weren't particularly interested in. If you dug a little deeper and got past that initial negative reaction, however, it was possible to pique their interest and intrigue them. A second example of this emerged during some research I was involved in at the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment. And we were looking into how the under-35s consumed recorded music. One of the questions we initially asked was what genres they listened to. They'd list pop, rock, R&B, metal, hip-hop, perhaps jazz. Out of about 100 participants, none of them listed classical music. However, if we follow that question up with one which specifically asked them if they listened to classical, then it emerged that in fact they did. They listened to it to relax or to study to. It just seemed they didn't like to admit to it in the first case, or at best they didn't really regard it as music they actively listened to. This all frustrates me. I'm someone who listens to a pretty wide variety of music, from jazz to some possibly embarrassing pop music, via electronic and dance to classical. I enjoy going to gigs and clubs as much as I like going to classical concerts. Personally, I get similar things from all of them. I listen to live music of any kind for it to touch me, to move me, and to transport me, and as a social event as well. One of the genres I love, classical, seems to have painted itself into a box, and part of that seems to be down to the name. I'm frustrated that a musical genre which I love has become the geek of the musical world, the kid in the playground that no one wants to be friends with. So how do we end up here? Well, I'm afraid to say that we are sometimes our own greatest enemy in the classical music business. Well, classical conjures up many negative stereotypes to new attenders, and unfortunately our business often doesn't do very much to dispel them. So first, let's look at the concert experience. I'm going to read you a condensed version, it's still a little bit long I'm afraid, of an entry on the Proper Discal blog I found several years ago, which looks at someone's experience of a concert at the San Francisco Symphony. So, 5 o'clock, I leave work early to make my 6 p.m. dinner reservation. 6 o'clock, I'm stuck in traffic and call ahead to get them to hold my table. 7:30, it's just as well no one wants dessert because it's time to pick out our tickets. 7:35, I arrive at the venue, straight into the will call queue. You can't get to the restrooms or the gift shop or the bar without a ticket, so I just hop on one leg for a moment. 7:40, I've got tickets, I've had a pee, and it's time to mill around with old people. All seemingly lost because the terms used to describe where you might find your seats are the same incomprehensible ones used to justify charging a range of extortionate prices for them. 7:55, I've been hanging around in the venue for 20 minutes, and finally someone gives me a programme. I sit down to read it, and they turn off the lights. The orchestra shuffles on stage as if no one can see them. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, they're wearing tailcoats. I feel a little bit underdressed in an outfit that only cost $2,500. People practice their instruments. In principle, I'm in favour of that, although this doesn't really seem like the time. 8:01. Michael Tilson Thomas comes on stage and tells us which bits of Sibelius 4 we should find glorious, creepy, scary, joyous and exciting, in the manner of a small child explaining why the joke he's about to tell you is funny. 8:10. The orchestra amble through Sibelius in the manner of a small child telling a joke they don't really understand. The peculiar thing is that this is probably the easiest and best known work in the programme, so either they didn't rehearse it at all, or they simply can't be bothered to play it properly. 8:50. The crowd dutifully applauds. Michael accepts the applause and walks off, and comes back on again. 9 o'clock. Michael introduces the world premiere of the piece they commissioned from Mason Bates. I must admit that I switched off after Michael said that Mason would be DJing when the man was clearly using a laptop to trigger samples. 9:05. They play the piece. It's nowhere near as bad as the talkie led me to believe. The tuba player gets his mute out, which is a rare treat. Michael could have talked us through all the things you don't often see that put an appearance in the piece. That would have made us feel like we'd learned something. 9:30, a standing ovation. I wonder if the orchestra would have played the Sibelius better if they'd paid him to write it. 9:35, I need to pee, so the interval provides welcome respite. I don't know how these old people manage. There's always a long queue at the ladies but not at the gents. This seems to be true of all concert halls, and someone should really look at that. 9:40, there's nothing to do in the interval except top up on fluids, so we sit in the crowded lobby and I try to convince my +1 that Sibelius is a good composer. 10 o'clock, we're back inside. Yuja Wang comes on stage and redeems the whole sorry affair with a rendition of Prokofiev's second piano concerto that I will never forget. At the end of each movement, we suppress the urge to fill the awkward silence with rapturous applause for reasons that no one can quite remember. 10:30, it's over. Almost everyone stands up to clap, and then almost everyone leaves. 12:45 a.m. I'm at home and in bed, trying to sleep, but somehow plagued by the notion that my evening out cost $350. It took 8 hours to hear 40 minutes of good music, and I could have bought Yuja's CD for $10. Does any of this sound familiar to you? The fact is that the concert experience we offer is, in fact, often exactly what people suspect we offer, and that's not necessarily a good thing. I don't know the stats for Toronto, but in London, a huge number of people come to concerts once and then never come back again, and there's probably a good reason for that. In the business, we take the concert experience and the rituals of it for granted, because all of us in the business are so immersed in it, but lots of it is at best baffling and at worst off-putting to a new attender. And this also leads me to ask why we essentially offer just one concert experience, and one that hasn't changed for perhaps at least 60 years. Everything else in life these days is tailored to you. Just look at TV. 20 or 30 years ago, you had just a few TV channels, and those channels had to provide you with everything you could possibly want, with documentaries or sport or entertainment. But now you can find a TV channel that's tailored to your own niche interest. But concerts have stayed exactly the same. At the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, I worked in a series of concerts called The Night Shift. These were late-night, relaxed concerts which we sold with the tagline, classical music minus the rules. We played in concert halls, gig venues, pubs and clubs. And it worked. We had an audience that was 85% under 35. 30% of them were students at university, and 20% were completely new to classical music. People were told that they could do what they liked, but the fascinating thing was that this audience turned out to be our best behaved. People didn't cough and shuffle between movements, they did what the composer indicated. As an example of that, we played a series of pub gigs where in the first half we had music for, I think, Mozart and Haydn, and it was obvious that after certain movements you'd applaud because it called for that. In the second half we played quite an intense Beethoven quartet all the way through, and over 6 gigs, not a single person applauded because the music just kind of shows you what to do. At the time, our violinist Maggie Faultless wrote, "This is about empowerment. Audiences want to have a bit more ownership of what they're listening to. The best performances involve a three-way relationship: the music, what's on the page, the audience, and the performers. The performers react not only to the written notes, but also to each other, and most importantly, to the audience. But all too often in today's concerts, the third part of that equation is forgotten. Often when we're performing, you can't even see beyond the first couple of rows, let alone to the back of a 1,000-seat concert hall. Playing in pubs to a group of people so close you can touch them has been an amazing experience. I'm loving it, and I can see and feel that audiences are too. You might think that the informality of these venues would create a casual relationship with the music. I'm often asked if pub venues means it's noisy. Not a bit of it. In fact, we found that there seems to be an enhanced degree of listening as people are much more directly involved in the music making, and this intense listening creates the atmosphere of the performance. I like to think that we are sharing in each other's listening." Now, despite the fact that the Night Shift series has been running for 10 years now, it still comes up against opposition. People say this isn't the right way to listen to music, that encouraging drinking and movement is wrong, although it could be argued it's actually more authentic. And it occurs to me that we may have somehow allowed classical music to be owned by a small but vocal minority of the audience, and that the fear of upsetting this small part of our existing audience is stifling our attempts to open the art form up. Now, not that the Night Shift success was just down to marketing, and I would say that being a former marketer. We positioned the event not as a classical music concert, but as a night out. We talked about the composers as if they were real people rather than semi-deities which everyone should automatically know about. We recognised that most of our audience had no clue who the Orchestra, the Asian Enlightenment were, or what the music was. We used celebrities to give us kudos, we made fun of ourselves, we involved the audience, and basically had a lot of fun. Of course, the Night Shift isn't unique. There are loads of great initiatives out there that look at different ways of presenting classical music. The New World Symphony in Miami, for example, has fantastic mini-concerts which last half an hour and club nights. The Aurora Orchestra in London has very interesting themed evenings. And the National Arts Centre Orchestra in Ottawa has its Wolfgang sessions. But these events are often seen as a sort of soft way in, or a side project, or a way to showcase contemporary music, rather than as a fundamental shift in the way we do things. In almost all cases, the 2-hour concert at 8 o'clock is still seen as the right way to consume classical music. And these side projects are seen as a way to lure people into a proper concert. And this wasn't the case with the Night Shift. We didn't mind whether people saw Beethoven 5 in a concert hall or in a gig venue. The important thing was that they came and saw it. Now, I mentioned that marketing was one of the key reasons behind the Night Shift's success. And this leads me to the other thing I think classical music gets consistently wrong: it's marketing. Now, this is the subject of a much longer talk, but we continue to over-market to people who will come anyway while sending the wrong message to newcomers. We sell the music often as something lovely, nice, or relaxing, or a classy night out, which relegates the music to something that is best viewed as an object in a museum case, rather than something living and breathing. We can appreciate it, but heaven forbid that we interact with it or react to it spontaneously. I feel we've become almost apologetic about the music. Instead of talking about the radical intent of much of it, or how shocking or new it might have been in its day, we instead retreat either to a world of opus numbers and dry academic facts, or succumb to the whole line of being relaxed by the music. The pop and rock journalist Paul Morley is a recent convert to the world of classical music, and in a recent conference speech I thought he really hit the nail on the head about some of our problems and why we need to be a lot bolder and more confident in the way we talk about our music. And I'd like to close my short talk with his words. He said, "It is pop music that is now about the past, about anniversaries and retrospection, and more about its revered dead or nearly dead icons. And from where I listen and think, it is classical music, whether from the 18th century or last week, that seems to be more about challenge, mystery, metamorphosis, or the essence of what it is to be human. In the end, the greater point is ensuring that music, as something more than entertainment, survives by ensuring that it still evolves, by marketing the music played by orchestras not as some sort of spa therapy, or teaching aid, or social welfare, but as something that contributes to our knowledge of music, and therefore of what it is to be human, here in space, at this weird moment in time." Thank you.
Well, I guess I should ask you the question that's on all of our minds, the tough question. Are you ready?
Am I ready?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, are you ready? Yeah, well, what's the most embarrassing pop music that you listen to?
Oh, gosh. Racking my brains now. I like quite commercial dance music to work to. It's very uplifting, so it's probably not cool, but I like that.
I'm sure you must be a fan of some of our Canadian pop artists like Justin Bieber and Carly Rae Jepsen.
Absolutely, yeah, it's a classic, yeah.
Good news all around. Well, I'm curious. So I mentioned the position that was created of the mayor's arts advisor. Now, that position was created because there is a divide, or at least there used to be a great challenge between people in outside of the downtown core accessing the arts, and arts organizations, which are mostly housed in the downtown core, reaching audiences beyond that. There are multiple variables why that's a struggle, transit being only one of them. So I'm wondering, how do you, as the newly minted leader of Tafelmusik, how are you going to engage with audiences outside the core?
Well, it's a good question, and my knowledge of the geography of Toronto is still somewhat limited. But one of the things we did with the night shift actually was to realise that we couldn't expect people to always come to us and to take the music to them, and part of that was to take the music to their local pub. So what we did was to embark on a pub crawl, and we went to pubs in North, South, East and West London and took the music to people, because for lots of people they will never come to a grand concert hall in the centre of town. It's just not something that would even cross their minds, no matter how we think of it as welcoming or diverse or any of those things. If you've never been to, say, the South Bank Centre in London or Colonel Hall here, it can be quite an intimidating thing to walk across that boundary. So I think we have to work at ways in which we can get rid of those barriers, and by taking music to people. And that's, I'm 5 months into the job, so it's all quite new, but I think that's something we should definitely look at. And we do have one series outside of the core, which is at the Toronto Centre for the Arts. But I know that other orchestras have had success doing what they call neighbourhood concerts, and that would definitely be something interesting to look at.
Yeah, great. Well, here's hoping we won't have to commute a whole hour into town to listen to your really such wonderful music. So because of the nature of Tafelmusik's, I guess, your mission, you escape my usual diversity question. Usually I ask all of the arts administrators I have here about getting more diverse repertoire on stage, getting different stories being told. So you're safe on that front. But I was wondering how you're going to reach out to more diverse audiences. I mean, baroque music is a subgenre of a specialty genre, and a genre that has certain implications by way of its origins and the audience one might picture engaging with it.
Well, I think I'd say two things in response to that. Firstly, I mean, this was kind of the premise of the night shift really, was that we thought there's nothing actually wrong with the music. The music has a universal appeal. When Handel was writing opera arias back in his day, they were about love and death and being cheated on, all these things, which are still resonant now, and those emotions are still things people feel now. So I think the music we play is absolutely relevant to people's lives, no matter who they are, and for lots of time it's simply the context in which we play it is the element which allows people to access that music. But also I think we can do things in another sense, the context, by putting our music into a narrative. So what Tafelmusik has done very successfully over the recent years is its multimedia programs. So there's some kind of narrative through line, and those programs can give our existing audience a new take on things, but they can also prove to be a way in for new audiences, and also allow us to link with cultures that perhaps we couldn't work with previously. So this May we've got a program coming up which looks at coffeehouse culture in Leipzig and Damascus, and that allows us to look at a different musical world and to sit it alongside ours and explore both of them together.
That's super cool.
It should be.
I'll hold you to that. So, what do you see as Tafelmusik's role in the arts ecosystem in Toronto?
Oh, it's a big question. In the arts ecosystem, well, in some ways, the kind of period instrument movement is kind of the rebel child of the classical music world. That's how I kind of look at it. Because it was, when it was started in the 70s and 80s, it was seen as something a bit wacky to do. It was a little bit kind of hippie, breaking away from that. People would question why you do this. Why would you play on an instrument that's not as good as a modern violin? We spent all this time evolving the violin or the oboe or whatever, and why would you go back to something that is, into some purposes, doesn't work quite as well? But in fact, you know, as we've heard tonight, you get something different out of it. You get different sonorities and a different feeling, and you can try and get back. We hate to use the word authentic, but something closer to what the composer would have known. But it's interesting having started up from being a quite different movement. And my previous orchestra was it was set up because they didn't want to work with conductors anymore. They were fed up of being told what to do, so the musicians set up their own orchestra. And that was a radical thing to do. But what's interesting now is, you know, 30, 40 years later on, is that we find that modern orchestras come to period orchestras to learn how to play in period style. So it's almost come full circle. But I would like orchestras like Tafelmusik, who are small and nimble and can react to things, to be maybe the agitators of the classical music world, and to go back to the roots a bit in that way.
Well, you're definitely the only person I've ever heard describe Tafelmusik as being part of a rebellious movement. That's a really interesting way to look at it. Maybe you'll be able to convince the rest of the city.
Absolutely, yeah. That'll be our aim.
Yeah. So, some of the other heads of music organizations in town are really concerned about innovation and social impact. And certainly with many orchestras in the UK, of which there are many, you would never dream of having an orchestra that didn't think about its social impact. So how do you feel about this when it comes to Tafel?
I feel that we have a mission, and that is to play the music of our era to the best of our ability, and to share that with the widest audience possible. And I feel that as an organisation which receives, you know, I think 30% of our turnover is public funded, we have a responsibility to make our music available to as wide an audience as possible, and to work with schools and younger people to you know, for their musical education. We have a niche, and part of that niche is working on next generation artists. So we definitely have a different mould to say with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra. But what I think we can do is offer something unique, and that's something I'd like to look at as I get settled in working with the musicians, to see what we can do that is different to what the other cultural and musical organisations of the city could do for our community. There's absolutely no point in us of replicating something that already exists, but there are things that we could do differently or better than other organisations because of our nature.
Yeah, yeah. So I guess that's how you'll try and make our city a better place. So if you could do anything with Tafel that hasn't been tried before, what would it be?
Wow, it's not a big question or anything.
Don't worry, if it's something you don't think the board will approve, we can edit this out.
No, no.
No one needs to know it's a secret.
You know what? I would just like, it's not really a project, but I would like to go back to the classical word, and this is a complicated thing because classical is actually a period of music as well as the big genre. But just thinking about the broad term, I would love Tafelmusik to play a part in people in Toronto thinking of classical music as something cool or exciting, rather than having, you know, a negative reaction. And that, as funny, goes back to that thing about the existing audience as well. I had people say to me, "But why do we want classical music to be cool? I don't want it to be cool. But I personally, I would love my friends to leap at concerts and come to things because they think it's a cool thing to do. So even if we can only persuade a tiny percentage of the under 35s of the city to think that classical music is a cool thing to do with their Friday night, I'll be very happy.
Okay. Raising the coolness factor. Good luck.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I have faith you can do it. We should probably open this up to the floor. Does anyone else have some questions?
I know that Tafelmusik has experimented with multimedia in some of their past productions. It's interesting to me because it's period music on period instruments, but then multimedia. And I'm wondering how you feel about that, and also just thinking about that in the context of a younger generation that's maybe used to being bombarded with multiple media all the time. And is that a direction you're interested in going? Some stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the multimedia projects are probably the reason why I knew of Tafelmusik in the first place, because it allowed the orchestra to have wider exposure. So the Galileo project was really the first of those, and the fact it was memorized as well was a big talking point. And that is essentially the reason I know of Tafelmusik, because it was on the front of a classical music magazine. We've had tremendous success with those, and they've become really the calling card for Tafelmusik across the world. You know, we go on tour to Australia or China or across the US, and we go with one of our multimedia shows. And as I said, they're great because they give our existing audience something extra. So they know the music, but they didn't know how it related to a painting by Vermeer or something like that. But and for new audiences, it's a way in because you've got something else to latch onto. You've got a narrative, you've got visuals, and so on. I don't think that there'll come a time when all our concerts are like that, because there's still, despite what I said, there's still value in the traditional concert for people who want that experience. But I think that, that there's something where we'll continue to explore multimedia in all its different ways, and it may not always be film. We might decide to do cross-genre projects with dance or theatre or visual arts, which help to kind of cross-fertilise audiences.
Monty.
The question that two of you were dialoguing about, in a sense, it almost imposes a sense of elitism. And part of that is almost atavistic, because people go to a concert because they want to be amused, and amused by the sound, to enjoy it. And how is it that you can recalibrate it? Because with students or young people, it's a question of exposure. And so much of that is environmental in terms of families where they grow up, not being able to access to listen to it, whether on the radio or on the phonograph or on CD. But I mean, listening to something that is saccharine as the Vivaldi's Seasons, and I use that as a neutral term, but it's joyous all the time. And then you can go into Stravinsky's Schizophrenia, and I mean, some of the pop artists take from that. And I mean, the Who have evolved from that in some of their better pieces. So it's a very loaded question, very complex, because to be sustained, you need to generate revenue. And how do you generate revenue? Because you want to broaden your client base.
Absolutely. I mean, it's not simple. And I think by perhaps packaging our music in a different way, presenting it in a different way, we will reach a different audience. But as you kind of touched on, that's kind of like an easy to get audience in a way. There are people who can be tempted in, and there's a deeper problem than that. Is that because the amount of musical education in schools is falling, there's a whole generation of people who have zero exposure to our music, and that's a much harder thing to solve. And I think that's something where we, together with funding bodies and government and other musical organisations, need to be joined up in our thinking to tackle that. We can't, as a single organisation, do that, I don't think.
I think every orchestra in the world is combating the challenges of bringing in younger audiences, whether it's through discounted prices, other initiatives, different repertoire. I think at the root of it is why young people are not interested in classical music. Is it just exposure, incentives to bring younger audiences into the concert hall or into pubs or into bars? I guess why, in your opinion, why are young audiences not interested in going to classical music?
I think it's a whole tangled web of things. I mean, part of it is, I touched on the way it's marketed and the concert experience. I think lots of the time people don't, it hasn't even occurred to them about that it might be something they would go and do. I mean, as I said in that study, people kind of didn't think if they listened to classical music, but if you actually drill down, they did, whether it be in film scores or computer game music or something. They're listening to orchestras without knowing it. But what was interesting with this night shift project I worked on is that when we did some research into it, there was no one single thing that tipped people into coming. It was the fact it was a low ticket price, it was in a venue they knew, it was because we kind of referenced that some of the music they might have heard in a film, it was because there was a cheap drink offer on, it was all these things together where the tip was a tipping point for making them to come to the event rather than any single thing. And I think a lot of it is kind of peer power as well, because it's people found out about the event through word of mouth. So once we had a positive word of mouth, it had a ripple effect, and that's the hardest thing to start. But there's not one single solution, and it also has to be sustained. Orchestras are very good at doing like a one-off project to get a different audience, and then kind of dropping them and doing something different the next year. And part of the success of this project was that we did it between 4 and 10 times a year for 10 years. And we could learn each time and evaluate it each time and go back and improve something each time, and build up a following that way.
Just to add to that, there was a study done fairly recently about people who go to classical music concerts, and it found that it wasn't level of education, it wasn't cultural background, it wasn't even your economic bracket that determined whether or not you came to a classical music concert, that it was actually whether or not you had been brought to a concert as a child, that was the most important thing, early exposure. So education programs, those youth education programs and outreach programs are so important. Mm-hmm. So
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this is starting to feel kind of like a class rather than a salon. So I think we should break, have some fries, have a couple drinks, enjoy the club, and just chat. Let's hang out. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Will.